Neil here, and we're talking today post-secularism with Peter Jones, and I want to ask him how to do evangelism in that context. But before we get to Peter, just to let you know what's coming up on The Pastor's Heart, our guest next week is Robert Creech. He's doing seminars for ministry leaders around the place this week, and he's going to be here to talk to us about family systems and congregational life. He's written a book on that, and I think it's going to be a super helpful discussion. We're going to be talking shortly. We're going to get Jenny Woodhouse back with us to talk more about domestic violence. This time when it happens in clergy families. Raj Gupta is going to be in on breaking through the 200 barrier, and Murray Campbell, and Peter Adam is coming in to talk to us really on the heart of a pastor, and so look forward to that. Now, Peter Jones, thanks for coming in and talking to us.
I'm happy to be here, Dominic.
Peter, of course, the founder and director of truthXchange. I'm hoping, sir, that you might be able to help us sharpen our thinking on evangelism, and particularly with the cultural changes that are going on at the moment. And I just spotted a sentence that you wrote: contemporary evangelism must therefore involve a clear presentation of biblical twoism, and this could hail a new day for God's Spirit to work in evangelistic outreach. And I just wondered if you could unpack that for us.
Well, it's growing out of culture shock, actually. I taught New Testament in France in a French Reformed seminary, teaching in French for 18 years. Does a good job to your French, by the way. If you ever want to learn French,
go and lecture.
And
actually, I remember a lovely story from Peter Jensen telling me that Henri Blocher was visiting us here in Australia, and he was testing me out on his English, and he didn't know the word for toothbrush in English, but he did know the word for superlapsarianism.
well, I understand that. Henri Blocher was a friend of mine, brilliant man. But anyway, so I taught in France for 18 years, and it really was a secular culture. You could not really speak in public about faith of any kind, really. And I remember when Michael Chang, who was a young tennis player, was 17 years of age, and he won the French Open. And they were interviewing him on national television. And he began to thank his parents, and he thanked the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, on national news that evening, they played this, and they had mockingly the Hallelujah chorus behind him speaking. And it was clearly a rejection of any kind of Christian expression. So you sort of got used to living in a secular culture. And then I was called to go back to the States. I went to the States to study. I actually am English and did most of my early studies in Great Britain, but got to the States a second time, having done my graduate work there, to teach in the States. And this was after an 18-year period of absence. And I realized that something odd was happening to the culture, which was very spiritual. America had always been very spiritual to me, but the spirituality had changed. And it was a very different kind of spirituality that I kept bumping into, and it was at that time called New Age spirituality. Remember that old-fashioned name? Yeah. And so I was driven to try to figure out what was happening in this once quote-unquote Christian culture. How could this stuff be present and be attractive and so on and so forth? So I was driven to sort of cultural apologetics. What's the culture saying, and how can we speak the Christian faith specifically and directly and intelligently to that culture?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of evangelism, actually. The Apostle Paul gives us the example of speaking to the pagan culture when he cites the Greek poets and has a great deal of respect. You know, he doesn't mock the culture that he's speaking to. He takes it seriously, but he develops it and speaks to it intelligently, and I thought to myself, I need to try to figure out what's going on. I wasn't thinking of evangelism. I was thinking of Christians and how Christians can understand their own faith in order, when they're questioned about it, that they can give useful answers. But recently, I've been driven to think that my thinking in terms of ontology, cosmology, which is a sort of worldview apologetics, is appropriate for evangelism like it's never been appropriate before. The reason being that we now live in the West in a culture that is developing its own ontology.
What do you mean by that?
Its understanding of existence. And to do that, it has to make appeal to religious elements of various kinds, and really the answers that it gives are pretty hopeless. People believe that they can create their own identity, and yet you ask yourself, who am I, this little being? How do I know what my identity is? Why would that make any sense to me, ultimately, to give me that responsibility? What about origins? You know, scientists are losing faith in secular explanations of origins, and especially in Darwinism. I read this afternoon that there are 2.5 million scientists who signed up to reject Darwinism.
Really?
In the USA. And that is, I believe, creating a certain malaise among the people we meet that are not Christian. And I think we have a clear message, both to help them understand what they actually think, which I call oneism, and the answer to that, which I call twoism. On the way over here in the Uber, I was talking to the driver, and his parents had been studying the Vedic traditions of India, and he seemed to know a lot about that, and talking about all the gods and everything, whereas the Christians believe in just one God, and that was obviously a weak point for the Christians. And I
So he was saying that was a weak point for the Christians.
well, you could tell by what he was saying that, you know, how can people have
Only
the temerity to say that? Anyway, I simply unwound that discussion and said, well, you know, actually, the difference between these Eastern religions and the Christian faith is that the Eastern religions are pantheistic and the Christian faith is theistic. That is to say, we believe that there is one creator and everything else is creation, whereas the Eastern religions believe that everything is divine and God is in everything. So it's, I said it, you know, the idea that there's one God, it's really there is one creator. If there were many creators, we'd be in a real mess. But he listened more carefully to that kind of speaking about issues, I think, than the way he'd heard it being spoken of, that you're wrong, there's only one God, the Bible says so. You know, that kind of a direct approach clearly hadn't worked with this fellow. But I think my wife said you planted some seeds. She was in the back listening to me. I think you planted some seeds for him to think about that he hadn't thought of before. So that's why I believe, and I keep pressing that now in the things I write, why perhaps because of the weakness of the present-day worldview of what we used to call secularism, let's call it progressivism, because of its weakness, its lack of a satisfactory answer to some of the basic human questions, that speaking to non-Christians about the nature of existence from a biblical point of view is not simply doing apologetics and saying, look how intelligent we all are, but really a possibility of asking the question, what do you believe and why? And here's a gospel that you can accept.
But okay, so just help me on. I've got the modernist becoming the postmodernist, becoming the post-postmodernist, and I was kind of thinking the way to reach the post-postmodernist is recognizing that essentially they're a secular pragmatist. But I think you're saying something quite different to that.
Yeah, I'm giving a lecture this evening on the era of the post-secular.
Yeah, so help me with the difference between what we might call the postmodernist and the post-secular.
Yes, it's very interesting. The postmodernist, actually, I believe, was part of the story of the undermining of secularism.
Mm-hmm.
Because the postmodernists said all truth is socially created,
Mm-hmm.
even secularism. And they rejected the bigotry of atheism because they didn't believe that there are, these mega narratives that the rejection of theism presupposes. And so they criticized the bigotry of secularism and the failure to realize that all truth is created by us and doesn't have any ultimate meaning. Now, of course, the problem with that for the postmodernists that it's a criticism of postmodernism,
Mm-hmm.
because they too speak truth, but then they have to say to themselves, but there is no mega narrative, so why should we be true?
Mm.
So I think they come back on themselves and become self-referential in the critique of secularism, and then it's a critique of themselves, and they're forced into a personal quest for their own meaning, which cannot really make an appeal to any mega narrative, which places them in a very embarrassing situation. And the post-secular era, it seems to me, is the result of this period of time, the undermining of secularism, postmodernism's failure to really establish itself. And the only answer is a totally personalized, almost irrational spirituality of paganism, the belief in oneself as divine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm finding where secularists are going, as a matter of fact.
Unpack that for me a little bit more.
The belief that the only answer is that I exist and there must be some meaning, but I have to create it.
I have to create it.
And I'm helped by spiritual paganism, which tells me that indeed I am divine. So I can create my own meaning. I can create my own identity.
Give me a couple of examples of the person and how people say that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's
the person I'm going to meet in the taxi or whatever. Yeah.
maybe people aren't that far
Mm-hmm.
in terms of what I'm describing.
Yeah.
I think many people just have come to the end of themselves as being able to give any ultimate description, a convincing description of existence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they are. Now, I think that we see many people in our day, because that's the point where they've come, are looking in all kinds of directions
Mm-hmm.
for sense, for meaning. And many of them go to the East. Many of them go to mindfulness meditation, yoga, in Hindu thinking of various kinds, which brings back into the soul this notion that there is a spirit, there is a divinity, and it's in me.
Mm-hmm.
And that doubtless is reassuring, as a
Mm-hmm.
matter of fact. Though I did read a 500-page book by a psychiatrist woman, a very intelligent American woman, who joined a Tibetan Buddhist sect in the States and was there for 30 years. And she practiced mindfulness meditation for 8 hours a day for 30 years. And at the end, she realized she was going nuts. She realized she was becoming insane, because the whole point of this sort of repetition of ideas, meaningful ideas, meaningless ideas, was to convince her that there is no sense, that there is no right and wrong. And she lost her ability to think.
Really?
She did. And somehow she had the intelligence to leave this sect, and she found her mind again.
Now, as I was reading in preparation for today, I was reading some of the things you'd written, which were quite critical of mindfulness, much along the lines that you've expressed. And I was wondering, when I first discovered mindfulness, not personally but hearing of it, it was in the context of hearing of people coming out of mental health problems.
Right.
And just, I'm running high on anxiety,
Right.
and so just to help calm me down from the anxiety, I try to do this. Would you still say that there's a place for that kind of activity in that forum, or are you so against it? Yeah.
Well, you know, all these things have some immediate usefulness. You know, they're not immediately bad. I always thought that mindfulness was this time of you took a period away and you stopped worrying about things and you just
Tried to centre on the things that are immediately before me rather than
That's
all
right.
my anxieties.
That's
you know?
right.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, this woman makes the point, though, that the real goal is to destroy what she calls, and I'm using this term as well, so it was interesting to find her saying it, to destroy the binary, that is, right and wrong, true and false. And so ultimately, mindfulness has as its goal for the reduction of tension and pressure, the elimination of right and wrong. And so, you know, you could say blaming yourself or something, but it wants to get finally rid of right and wrong.
Right.
Because the ultimate goal of paganism is the joining of the opposites of everything, including right and wrong.
Now, how might, I mean, I'm just trying to think about that conversation in the car that you had, the taxi, the Uber.
This was a few minutes ago.
Yeah,
right?
a few minutes ago. If the trip had been longer, and you'd actually been able to get to the gospel,
Right.
how might you have? Because as you've described him, you're kind of describing him as on the forefront of popular culture.
I think
Yeah.
so. I
Yeah.
think he was a very bright fellow and was doing this kind of thinking clearly. You know, once you begin to present the biblical truth, you come face to face with one of the massive problems we have in our world today, and that is intelligence, as you know. That's why people are leaving Darwinism, because Darwinism is a totally unintelligent way of describing the 3.5 billion letters in the DNA code that put our lives together and function perfectly. It's a logical language that we find within ourselves, and we ask ourselves, where does this intelligence come from?
Yeah.
And people like John Lennox, of course, have made that point very strongly. And I'm talking to my own son, who's walking away from the faith, and who has walked away from the faith. He's doing a PhD in Holland. And I sent him some of this stuff, and he says, you're right there. I have to take account of intelligence.
Right.
So I'm continuing to work with him. But the point is, once you have established intelligence, I think the next move, because this is what we understand by intelligence, is personhood.
When you say that I as a person am an intelligent person, that's the point you're making with intelligence.
No.
Yeah.
You are saying that, but you're saying the universe is
The
intelligently
universe,
conceived.
right. Yeah. Intelligently conceived. Yeah. Okay.
But if you say that, it seems to me that the next step is all that we know about his intelligence is it's associated with personhood. And so God is not simply a abstract intelligence. God is personal.
Yeah.
And then, of course, even though it's such a mystery, you can actually do evangelism teaching the Trinity.
Really?
The reason being that the Trinity assures us that we have a God who is both transcendent and personal. He's personal because he's trine, and because he's trine within himself, he doesn't need us to be personal. There's a personal relationship between the members of the Trinity that it can be described as love and personhood that's endemic to God himself. He is personhood. And that's why when he reveals himself in our human state, he reveals himself as God the person, which I think is the move from ontology to soteriology, from the meaning of the world as we look at it generally as intelligent, to the gospel as a personal revelation of God to persons.
Let me see if I can get you to do it for us in a nutshell. I'll be the taxi driver. It's been really good talking to you on this trip. Thanks so much for sharing what you've shared. I know I've got to go and you've got to go and do your interview in there in a moment, but in 60 seconds, could you just tell me what you as a Christian believe?
Well, I would certainly tell him about the mystery of the Trinity, because I really think it's a new day for evangelism to integrate the Trinity into what we say about God.
So how? Well, I'm just trying to put it into my words for if I was you. Well, the God that I believe in, and I've just said to you, there's only one. Is three persons in that God?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The Father, the Son, the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Where do I go from there?
Okay, so if we have personhood in God as the origin of all notions of intelligence and personhood, next we understand God creates. God doesn't have to create, but it's a loving act to share his existence with others,
Mm-hmm.
who are different than he, by the way. And so we are distinct. We are the creation. He's the creator.
Mm-hmm.
But if he's a personal creator and he creates us, there has to be a line of personhood relating us to him. And as you know, if you read anything, taxi driver, I know you have,
Mm-hmm.
That the Christian gospel speaks about Jesus Christ being the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, a project that God conceived of to solve the human problems of sinfulness. And so the Son, who is both human and divine, bears our sins on himself, carries the penalty of those sins on him in our place. And that's why the gospel is so powerfully personal, because it gives us the good news that while our persons are sinful, they are forgiven. Now, will that make him become a Christian? I don't know, but that's the essence of the gospel, it seems to me, and why that should be interesting, at least to him. Inasmuch as one of the real problems of these Eastern religions, and even Islam, we were in another Yuba the other day, and this Pakistani fellow was telling us how difficult his life was trying to become an Australian citizen. And at the end, my wife, just as we were getting out of the car, she said to him, "Can I pray for you?" And she put her hand on his shoulder and prayed for him. I bet that's the first time in his life
He's been prayed
anybody has done that to him.
And that's the thing he'll remember out of that day. Yeah. Can I ask you, I was reading also, you've written something about the trend towards this paganism in Catholicism.
Where did I write that?
Oh, well, I've been reading on your website.
Well,
And concerns about Pope Francis.
That's right. Yeah, no, I am watching Francis moving the church to a very radical liberal theology. And that includes the integration of animistic spirituality. He's now in the middle of this Amazon symposium where he is, along with lots of liberal cardinals and bishops that he's called to Rome, trying to integrate the spirituality of the Amazonian natives.
How do you think, what's your crystal ball of what's going to happen in Catholicism?
Well, my ball is cracked, so I don't necessarily see that clearly, but I really do worry that there will be a split in the Roman Catholic Church, and that's not good for us, I think, as Christians. Even though we're Protestants, the Catholic Church has carried a real burden in the secular world by maintaining some of the fundamental structures of the way God created the world in terms of sexuality and marriage and things of that nature. And if we have a massive breakup of the Roman Catholic Church and we have one side of it claiming to be the Catholic Church and going in the full direction of all these new ways of understanding who we are as sexual beings and so on, I think we'll find ourselves more and more as Christians a minority.
And I hadn't heard anybody say that before, but when you say it, you think, oh, I think you might be right.
The crystal ball is working.
And you think in our lifetime that might be something that might happen?
You know, I read some very conservative Roman Catholic cardinals and so on, and they are criticizing the Pope. They're almost calling him a heretic.
Mm-hmm.
But there are others saying we cannot split the church. And so some don't want to actually go so far as to split the church, because that is the one thing that they all believe in, the Holy Catholic Church. And so there may be a pullback, I don't know. Or they may find some way, excuse the phrase, impeaching.
Francis. When you're an American, you can use that.
I'm actually English.
Oh, sorry, of course, yes. Yeah,
but I'm up to here in impeachment stuff. But some of them are looking for a church way of impeaching this Pope.
On the Pastor's Heart, we ask our guests what God's been doing on your heart. And perhaps you could share.
Well, he's been exercising me as I see my really brilliant son, who's doing a PhD in Leiden, Holland, who doesn't walk with the Lord. And I've started, after some time, he was back home in July, and I said, his name's Toby, and I said, could we have some kind of an ongoing conversation about where we all are and where you are in your thinking? And so he said, sure. And since then, I've been emailing him, and he's been emailing me. And the Lord has been leading me to think some really interesting thoughts about some of the stuff I've just been talking about in terms of the place of intelligence in the universe, and how this really caused my son to think deeply about that. And he has problems, like many of us do, with God sending people to hell. And, that's not a simple thing to explain. But some of those problems he talks about. And I've been reading books and trying to come up with what I can be saying to him of his objections to the Christian faith. So I really feel encouraged to do this, and both as love for him and as a service to the Lord.
Well, I will pray for your son, and thank you very much for coming and sharing with us today.
Thank you.
My guest on the Pastor's Heart has been Peter Jones from truthXchange, and I do hope you'll be with us next week when we're talking to Robert Creech.
Can we say something? truthXchange is spelled truthXchange, no E. If people want to go on our website, truthexchange.com.
.com. Great. Thanks very much for coming in.
You're welcome.